Let's talk power this morning, the all-important topic of power, generation, distribution, supply, as a transmission now, all of the value chain. Over the weekend, we got news that we witnessed yet another grid collapse, and that was the third time in just less than a month or thereabouts. In fact, the previous time we had in successive days grid collapse, and this is not something, it just made a bad situation worse, as it were. A lot of Nigerians don't have adequate power supply in the first place. So with the grid collapse, it just makes it worse. But we're trying to find out what exactly is responsible for this. We've been on this journey for decades. And this morning, perhaps we can find out where the challenges are and point those in authority the right direction so we can resolve this. And joining us to do just that, we are joined right here in our Lagos studio by engineer Arthur Usiagu, who is a chartered electrical engineer. He's a member Nigerian Society of Engineers. He's also CEO CCS Technology Limited. Good morning, Engineer Usiagu.
Good morning.
And joining us from our Abuja studio is Professor Frank Okafor, who's a professor of electric power and control engineering, University of Lagos, and former Commissioner, Engineering and Performance Monitoring, Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission, that's NERC. And right next to him is Comrade Joe Ajero, who is the General Secretary, National Union of Electricity Employees, NUI, and Deputy President, NLC. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us on the program as well. I'd like to begin from Professor Okafor. You know, reading out the designations and experiences of our panel on the program this morning, it hit me that, wait a minute, we have such, brilliant minds, experts, and so much in the power sector in Nigeria, but we're where we are today in spite of all of that. So, I don't know, is there a simple explanation as to why we have so much resources in terms of human capital? I mean, we've thrown in a lot of funds into it as well, but we're still where we are with epileptic power supply in the country.
Well, thank you so much. Really impressed by the fact that this issue came up. The power sector had seen a lot of setbacks due to the way, I would say, things are really planned. When you look at it, from 1992, we have had about 3,500, 4,000 megawatts of grid supply. And this is 2022. We are still having 3,500 and about 4,000 of grid supply. I think that we should simply do things probably in a reviewed form. If you want to look at it, seriously speaking, the nation is large, and the grid power is low. I will tell you that the non-grid power is probably more than the grid power as we speak today in Nigeria. And therefore, I have personally looked at it, and I think that first and foremost, the grid is very weak, very, very weak, in the sense that the amount of power that is supplied by the grid is low. So we have to strengthen the grid by increasing the power that goes to the grid. It's a little bit complex. There's also the issue of control. 2 weeks ago, that's on the 14th, 250 megawatts just left the grid suddenly by some relay setting issues around the data line. And the grid collapsed, 250 megawatts. The next day, 300 megawatts had left in Shiroro, and the grid collapsed. Last year, that couldn't have collapsed the grid. So we really have to take a second look at the issue of the strength of the grid and start the corrections from there. There is more to say, but let me give others a chance to make their own contribution.
Thank you very much, Prof. So you say weak grid and control issues. And I'll ask the same question of Comrade Ajero, who's, vast in this sector before I come to Lagos. Same question I put to Prof. We have vast human resources, brilliant minds. We have laws, by the way, which we have tweaked from time to time. We have thrown in a lot of money. There's been a lot of conversations like this. But why are we still where we are? Is there a simple explanation for that for you?
Well, thank you very much. The issue has to do with management. You know, the human resource is there, and then the issue of management comes to play. You know, it takes a good manager to transform human and material resources to a great success. Like Professor Okafor cited, we have been hovering around 4,000 megawatts for almost 2-3 decades. It doesn't show that there is planning. It doesn't show that, you know, we have taken this matter serious. To such an extent that we failed to realize that during dry season, that the water level will go down, that the hydro stations will not operate optimally. And at this point in time, we continue to experience this year in, year out. We tinkered with the privatization process. And the privatization process now gave ownership of the generating companies to certain individuals who are supposed to, service their stations, make room, for maybe putting off their stations and the ones that are supposed to come on board. And there should be a coordinator who should coordinate it. If we are putting off Shiroro power station, we make sure that we come in, bring in a weak power station, to maintain the grid. Like he said, the grid is so weak. You can't have such a wide grid system, and then you are pushing in 3,000 megawatts, 2,000 megawatts. It doesn't work that way. And it has nothing to do with the people, the brains who have, because they can only transmit, what is available to them. And we keep on saying, we can generate 11,000 megawatts. Meanwhile, shortage of megawatts is what is leading to this grid. And the second factor is that we can't even police the lines, like the one that just happened a few days ago, around Port Harcourt region. You see people vandalize a line, you lost 400 megawatts, and it leads to grid collapse. So if we can't even protect ourselves, if the security situation in the country is such that, we can't even take care of, transmission or lines or generation lines, then we'll continue to experience this. So it's a mixed bag, on what is happening in Nigeria. We can't continue to revolve around 4,000 megawatts. It's not sustainable. It's not possible. So how do we go beyond that? It is clear that those people that they sold these
Comrade Ajero, we'll come to those issues in a moment. We'll come to those issues in a moment. We'll come to that, the collapse of Odokpani Korekbene transmission line and all of that. But let me get Mr. Arthur's Osiago's opening comments on this one. So we've had the academia point of view. He's also given us a regulatory, with his experience in the regulatory, Comrade Ajero has given us an inside view of these issues. For you, a nation of 200 million people, we're still grappling or managing 4,000 megawatts, 3,000, 4,000. What do you think is responsible? Any simple explanation for you?
Thank you, Kaudi. I think for the past 16 years, we've been in this same trajectory. And it's very clear that what we are currently doing cannot take us out of the woods. Now, in 2006, the Electricity Reform Act, came upstream. We were quite happy that we are going to get out of all the problems bedeviling the Nigerian electricity sector. But unfortunately, because we kept doing the same thing and expecting different results, we are where we are. Currently, there's no saying that the grid is actually weak. We are a country of over 200 million people. And if you look at Nigeria, it's really a very big country, over 900,000 square kilometers. And you are running a monogrid system. It's very simple. You generate electricity from maybe Papalanto here. You power the grid, and you transmit this grid on a network. I mean, transmit this power through the grid to a very large network. With all the turbulence, with all the trouble, you don't expect a country as big as Nigeria to be running a monogrid system. So the greatest problem we're having is the fact that a country as big as Nigeria is running a monogrid system. It's not sustainable.
Monogrid?
Monogrid means that you have only one grid taking charge of the entire nation. For example, from Lagos to Maiduguri, we are talking about over 1,400 to 1,500 kilometers. How do you monitor? How do you sustain this colossal network of grid system? A simple way is to break this monogrid into its various constituents.
Unbundle the TCN.
Unbundle, for example,
is that what you mean?
Yes. Why can't Lagos, that is consuming 50% of electricity in Nigeria, why can't Lagos have its own microgrid system? Why can't Kano have its own microgrid system? And you replicate the same thing. And you provide all the necessary energy mix. This problem of grid collapse will be a thing of the past.
But one of the arguments that's kind of stood against that was the law. You know, I think it's part of the reason that the constitutional review is also ongoing now. Do you think that will significantly address that part?
Absolutely. You see, we started the reform, from a very, very good position, but we left out some essential aspect of it. Why should this country be holding TCN to its chest? It's totally it's not sustainable anymore. And it's very clear it can't work.
Okay. Prof, some data, some investigation carried out, over the years says that between, I think, 2013 and 2020, we had about 130 grid collapses, some partial, some total collapse, and you have referenced a good number of them as well. And this has been a concern for many, many years. But it's not the way we started. And most would expect that we should anticipate population growth. We should anticipate urbanization. At what point did we stop doing the needful in this nation that led us to where we are today? Because we've been battling this, as my colleague said, for decades.
Thank you so much. I wouldn't dwell so much into the history. The reason is that we are more concerned with what will change the situation and not what has really happened. I will tell you that in 1992, for instance, there was no grid collapse. Simply because some people, then Engineer Shombolu, now late, managed the grid properly. And there was SCADA system that worked. They could see what they were managing and all that. Like I said before, let me come down a bit so that you don't call me an academic again. The issue of islanding. Somebody was talking about microgrid. We have to understand one fact. Grids are not meant to have the same structure all the places. I think we need to look at the way we are controlling our grid. Let there be a situation where area controls will be more effective. That is to say, there's the power being supplied. Then an area would just take the power, pay for it. When there's a fault, it can happen that it breaks off. There will be no collapse on their own part. And indeed, like the other gentleman said, there will be no grid collapse. But there could be area issues, and those areas are control structures that can manage themselves and can go into what is called islanding. That's to say, if there's a problem with the entire grid, they break into islands. If you look at India, for instance, there are plants that just serve a particular area. They don't go to serve the whole grid, only when there's a fault and you need them. So I remember telling the former managing director of MBED that she doesn't have enough power, but she has very expensive power. That is just the problem. We need to allow more power to come into the grid and decide on the terms so that it is not so expensive. In 2019, for instance, due to agreements signed, 109 billion was paid for power not delivered, trying to maintain agreements, which is unnecessary. If we try to get the brilliant group you talked about to look at these issues and government listings, we can get the grid to function such that collapses will be a thing of the past, and the grid power will increase. Of course, because somebody can be supplying the grid and also supplying the local consumers if need arises, and there could be islanding when a fault comes. If you look at the last 3 faults, they are avoidable, but it's not to do with TCN. TCN is only, like Ajero said, TCN is doing what they can and cannot do beyond that until the issues are addressed holistically.
Speak also to a concern a number of people have raised about over-centralization. I think that's what Mr. Swaglu here is trying to refer to. Over-centralization of the power of the electricity power infrastructure in the country. You don't want to go to the past, but if we don't know where we are coming from, you elders tell us we don't know where we are going. And you also talked about the fact that infrastructure is weak. So I don't know if there is a nexus between those two issues of over-centralization and weakness of the infrastructure that we have.
What we call weakness here is that there is one parameter that measures the amount of power you need to change the frequency by 1 hertz. If, for instance, you have 3,000 megawatts and you divide by 50, what do you get? So it means that when the power changes by 60 megawatts, the frequency changes by 1 megawatt. So it's a very weak grid. In a section of the US, if the power changes by 2,000, nothing changes. The thing, the system just does a little shaking and it's fine. So that is what this issue of better control will tend to address, such that the over-centralization will be, that word will really not be the word. The word will be that there's a grid, all right, but there's enough sectionalization such that there won't be at least a total collapse. If there's a problem in one area, the other areas can just break off the area that has problems and continue to do their service. That is one part of it. Then you talked about what has happened before. If you look at from that 1992, I said there was no collapse. Then there was no new power plant up to about 2000. And power plants are machines that keep deteriorating. And you must make sure that they are sound in terms of functionality. And that's part of our problem of weak infrastructure, apart from the weakness of the I would say, the theoretical part. But there's also the infrastructure that changes. I won't want to go into, I just know that we have a very short time. That's why, otherwise, there were issues even 2 years ago I had to raise, about trying to balance the functionalities of the machines, and not really based on who owns it, but how it functions.
Okay,
we need
so
to also address that.
That's a major point, and I'm glad you broke it down, so you wouldn't say I'm accusing you of being an academic yet again. But let me take this to Comrade now, and it's been postulated, or it's been suggested, that there needs to be an unbundling of the TCN. I know Prof is speaking to the fact that, well, maybe not a change of administration, but a change of the mode of administering the transmission sector of the power sector, in just the transmission subsector rather. But let's be honest, if we keep doing the same thing and expecting a different result, I mean, some will say that's not wise. So don't you think that lends credence to those saying, well, let's find another way to manage the TCN, let's unbundle it. This monogrid system, as Engineer Osuago has talked about, is not working for us. Just a little hiccup and everybody has to pay for it. So don't you think that gives credence to those saying, let's find another way to manage the TCN, for example, unbundling it?
Well, you can take it equally from what he said, doing the same thing and expecting a different result. In 2005, we unbundled the power sector, from one NEPA to one PSCN, and then we got 18 companies, and then the product is what we're having now. If you equally move further to unbundle the 18 successor companies to 50 or 60 companies, you still get the same result, around 4,000 megawatts. If we are talking of over-centralization of what? Over-centralization of what is not available. Yeah, and then, even one section, like you mentioned, Lagos, can take what is what we have now. And then we are talking about centralization. And people who are, market people, who are talking of the market, wants to talk about unbundle, give to A or B, the issue of management. The unbundling of the power plants, the unbundling of the discos have not produced any efficiency. It has not produced anything. In as much as, I'm not averse to when you say, unbundle a transmission section state. What is the aim that we're going to get from it? Is it when we generate, it goes to one place, or it comes to, or should it go to NCC or Shobo for them now to, allocate, maybe Lagos needs this needs this? I'm not against unbundling it, but somebody agitating for unbundling of what we have today, should equally tell us what we're going to aim, because the experience we have with unbundling in a sector has not produced any report. What it has produced is, in fact, increase in expenditure level. You now have 18 MDs, 18 general managers, all of them around 4,000 megawatts. Now go further into the unbundling of, the TCN, we'll still be revolving on the same 4,000 megawatts. Let us address the issue of, insufficiency of the power itself. If you have 7,000 megawatts now, are we going to still experience the grid collapse the way we are experiencing it? The answer is no. I think.
Okay, Comrade, if you can break this down for us. Why do we have insufficient power? And I'd like you to break it down, really. Let Nigerians understand. Because, we can't take the power sector in isolation and say the discos are not distributing well enough. Don't forget, of course you know well enough that it's a value chain. So help Nigerians understand first, how much power do we generate? Okay, how much is then taken by the TCN to the discos? If you can give figures, how much do we generate? How much does the TCN take off the generating companies, across the grid? Then how much gets to the distribution companies for onward distribution to the consumers?
Okay, let's take it this way. Currently, we're hovering around 4,000 megawatts because it's not the same thing every day.
Is that generation or transmission?
Now, the 4,000 megawatts, the 4,000 megawatts we have.
Comrade, pardon me, the 4,000, is it what we're generating or what is taken off to transmit to the discos?
What is given to the transmission?
Oh,
That's
from
4,000
the
megawatts.
GENCOs, it's 4,000 megawatts.
Yes, that's what they are bringing, you know. And then from the transmission to even the discos, you know, there are equally challenges because some discos will equally not pick loads. You know, even the 4,000 we are generating, some discos will tell you that if you say take 200 megawatts, they will say no.
Okay.
They'll give you
the transmission
reasons.
parts,
Some will say
comrade,
based on.
is the TCN able to take up that 4,000 megawatts, which you say is being generated by the GENCOs?
TCN is ready to take 5,000, 5,500, 6,000 today.
Is it able to take it?
That's
all
not
of
where,
that?
Yes, that's not where our problem. But I'm saying that even from the 4,000, you know, the discos as at today, when you say, oh, take 200 megawatts, take 300 megawatts, they still reject load. You know, so that's the major problem we have. You know, it is only when you now move beyond that 5,000 or 6,000 capacity of transmission, then that will now, you know, heap the blame on them. But if you have not given them enough, you know, to transmit, they can still be hiding. Their inefficiency will equally be hidden, you know, until you give them enough power to transmit.
Okay, that's quite interesting because the GENCOs will tell you they're even able to give as much as they can, but they get, you know, this directive to shut down or step down how much they generate. But you said discos reject. Why do discos
you are talking
reject?
of their installed capacity. The GENCOs talk of their installed capacity, you know, not actually what they can give. If it is actually what they can give, we won't be having this problem, you know, of a grid collapse here and there. If you lose 200 megawatts from somewhere, you suffer from grid collapse. They are talking of installed capacity, and that was the power purchase agreement, you know, that was made reference to before. You know, if you are paying them based on installed capacity, they'll be telling you that, you know, I can generate 600 megawatts. But in actual fact, what are they bringing to the grid?
But, you know, the GENCOs, just before I come to the engineer in our studio, the GENCOs have said they are told to shut down from time to time, saying, you know what, don't do beyond this because we don't have the capacity, that's from the TCN, to take up all of that. Can you confirm that?
Well, I've not heard that as of today, you know, but if that's the situation that the TCN can take more than 5,000 megawatts, then we'll take the blame to them.
Okay, let's come to Engineer Osuagwu. So this controversy about what is generated, what the TCN can take, and what is being willed to the discos, where do you think the challenge is?
It's a massive chain. It's a massive chain that is having laws of dislocation. And the simple reason is very clear. I've said it so many times that we'll continue to hover around these troubled waters until we do the right thing. And the right thing, as I said, I've advocated for this severally. But I know that those in the labor subsector will say, what is this engineer talking about? You see, you can't take a goat to the market, sell the goat, and you refuse to, you know, release the rope. Government must try as much as possible to take their hands off electricity subsector. That is the major issue. If they don't do that, we'll continue to hover around this trajectory for the next 10 years.
I'm sorry.
For the past 16 years,
but on that,
we've been talking about this. It's a recurrent decimal every day. Now, look at it critically. We had this same issue with NITEL so many years back. And government pumped so much money, entirely some of these funds disappeared. The same way government is pumping money in all the subsector. The GENCOs we are talking about, yes, they've done complete, you know, government has sold most of them. The TCN is still being held by government. How about the discos?
And there's MBET in that mix, by the way.
40% of ownership is also being held by government. Now you have a wholly, you know, separate body that generates electricity. You set up MBET again, the bulk trader, that will sit in between and pay the GENCOs on behalf of the discos, do you think the discos will not be lazy? They'll be lazy because MBET is sitting there. So whether they sell or not, government is there. The Prof talked about spending over 100 billion, paying to keep contractual agreements. These are wrong. See, government should take its hands off completely. And you begin to see rejuvenation of the power sector. People have clamored that, government cannot do that. See, the problem is that the government is still looking at electricity as a kind of a social, work thing.
Isn't it?
No.
Okay, well,
No.
Mr. Osiagu, when you said the other time that, and you've said it over and over again, and this is not the first time you are saying it, by the way, that government should completely hands off
The goats, by the way.
the entire, spectrum. So there is GENCOs that, as you said, fully deregulated, private sector driven, transmission companies, fully government owned. But you also heard Mr. Ajaero say, we don't have a problem with the transmission segment. Where we are having a challenge is the discourse. We'll talk more about that when we return from this break. Please stay with us. Thanks for staying with us. Well, Mr. Osiagu, that conversation you talked about government handing off, it's understandable. Everyone has talked about that. And when we talk about deregulation, we are quick to always cite the telecom sector. But then there are those in your industry who say that the telecom sector is completely different from the electricity sector. So we are talking about this now that you said that government should completely hands off. But government is in full control of TCN, and according to Mr. Ajaero, who works in the sector, the transmission companies are good to go. Where we are having a major challenge as far as he's concerned for what he's saying is the discos who refuse load sometimes.
That's not completely true, Ayo. Take your mind back. You will know in the last 7 years, there has been continuous effort to increase the grid capacity. After 7 years, the grid capacity has not gone more than 5,000 megawatts.
When you say grid, which one? Is it the GENCO? Because average Nigerian there is hearing grid and is wondering
Okay,
which
I'm talking about the transmission.
That's the transmission,
Yes.
all right.
Now, and so much money has been put into this aspect of making the grid, work. We have installed capacity, all the generating stations in this country, in excess of 12,000 megawatts. Now, if we have 9,000 megawatts today generated, can the grid wheel that capacity? The answer is no. Cannot. The grid cannot wheel it. So there's a fundamental problem. When the Prof talked about the weakness of the grid, these are some of the things we are talking about. The grid cannot wheel it. And you also heard that some GENCOs are being asked to switch off. You understand? The issue is that if the GENCO generates and the discos and the grid, capacity cannot take them, government will have to pay.
Now,
because there's already an agreement.
Can you kindly slow down and let me understand what you're talking about? Okay. Because I'm at a loss. This grid is squarely transmission grid. The collapse is just transmission grid, not generation grid. When you generate, you feed into the transmission system. Yeah.
Then the transmission system all over the country makes up the grid. Put it in a layman's language. But if you have enough capacity in terms of generation, and you don't have the capacity to wheel this generated power to the discos, then there's a problem. You've not done anything.
Okay. Mr. Ajaero, would you kindly very quickly respond to that one? Because you said the other time that we don't have a problem with transmission. Where we have a challenge is in the area of distribution, because the GENCOs sometimes they reject, the discos, they reject the load. Can you respond to some of the things that you heard Mr. Osiagu say here?
Well, I had him clearly. It's worrisome, the analysis he is giving, because if the GENCOs are generating enough power the transmission capacity as at today, and this is verifiable, can take up to 7,000 megawatts. But he's talking about 9,000 megawatts. The transmission capacity is made for what we are doing now. If it can take 7,000 megawatts when we are generating 4,000 megawatts, I don't understand what he means by, by the transmission capacity not being able to carry the challenge. Of course, there are contracts, to increase it to up to 15,000 megawatts that are ongoing in anticipation, that the generating capacity will increase. But I'm even saying that even from the 4,000, that is willed, at the point of taking it to the end users through the discos, that some discos are still rejecting load. That's the point I have made here, and it's clear. And I didn't understand the reference, he made to NITEL and all that. As far as I'm concerned, that is not relevant in what we are discussing now. What we are discussing is that clearly we are on 4,000 megawatts. And that is what is coming from, the generating stations. To even at times we see to 3,000 something megawatts. And the transmission capacity will sit. That even with the 3,000 something, I repeat, either based on weak, distribution points or whatever, those ones will tell you, no, I will not take 200 megawatts, I will take 100 in that order. And that's the situation we have as at today, and these are verifiable facts.
Let me take this to Prof. Prof, I know you want to comment on this. So the question of whether or not we generate enough, whether or not the transmission company can take enough, or is it the discos? Where exactly is the issue? I mean, you have that view from the regulatory body, at least from your time there.
Yes. In exactly 1st of March, 2021, the TCN willed 5,800 megawatts, and that much was taken by the discos at the peak period. Peak period usually is between 6 p.m. to 9, 10 p.m. What happens in the case of this argument is that usually when the generating company generates, a part of TCN is the control, which is called the dispatch unit. The dispatch unit takes this power from the GENCOs and now will it, as it were, the transmission part will see to the discos. Remember that electric power is determined by the demand. The supply is determined by the demand. If there's no demand, no power is taken, whether it is available or not. There are usually two parts which I want you to please understand. Between this 6 p.m. to 9 p.m., we have what we call a peak period in the day. Most of the time in Nigeria is purely residential load, most of the time. So that's why the peak period occurs when I'm talking about when people have come back to work. So at that time, most of the time, the entire generation is taken. But other times, you find out that a lot of the power available for generation is not taken, not because TCN doesn't have the capacity, but because there's no demand for it. And that is where we are. I will also quickly add that the problem we are talking about, transmission, cannot be solved by unbundling of TCN. TCN is good the way it is, but it's simply, like I said, a little change in the management of the grid, in the structuring of the management, not unbundling, definitely, because having several companies does not change anything. This area control I'm talking about will still be owned by the same TCN. It doesn't change anything. It's just that you sectionalize the network and each of them takes power from the grid, but can break off as an island if there's a fault. That's just the thing. Is there something to change and make things better? But as we speak today, the problem is definitely not TCN. The problem as at today, and this great thing, is generation and consumption. You know, the discourse, I will let you know this also from the regulatory experience. The discourse are supposed to take minimum quantum of power in a day. And they try to optimize in quotes. What really they optimize is, if I take this minimum, how can I make the best money out of it? So most of the time, power, you are in darkness, not because there's no available power. It's just because the disco feels that giving you power will not give the disco enough money. That's just, so we need to address the issue of
But Prof,
disco collecting enough.
Prof, a lot of issues really, I'll try to see if I can touch on them. But this last one you said that discos won't give you because they can't make as much money. I don't know if I got that right. But don't you make more money if you give power? I mean, people consume more and they earn more money. I don't know, is that what you were trying to say?
Yes, the issue is, remember, the cost of power is, I would say, segregated. You might be paying 52 naira, for instance, per kilowatt hour. There is the band D and band E. Band E pays about 37, and band D pays about 39 or so. So most of the time, the disco will prefer to sell this power to the higher bands. The industrial man pays about 62 or 63. You know, so depending on where you belong, it's the same power they are selling, remember. So they want to sell it at the highest price most of the time. That's the optimization I'm talking about. You know, but if we develop avenues where the discos can collect enough, in quotes, then you can see that more power will be taken and more generation. Once there's more demand, I'm sure building a power plant is not a serious matter. It's just because when you want to build and you think of the demand for it,
right?
You want to keep your money. That's just what happens.
So another point you made,
why
Prof,
we are still hovering at about 4,000.
Okay, Prof, another point you made, pardon me. I mean, I think it still makes sense to give more power because you earn more money. And I can even say that those within the high bands are not even getting as much power anyway, so you wonder to what point. But you also made the point about, the problem being with the generation and the distribution end, essentially absorbing the transmission of any, do I say, blame in all of this. But, the generation will tell you they still have issues with gas supply. They have monies they are being owed. I remember some of them speaking very passionately about that. And of course, the shutdowns, which they are told to do from time to time so they don't, as it were, overcrowd the system. So how is the GENCO, or how are the GENCOs the problem in this one?
During the off-peak period, the GENCO generates power that is not taken by the discos. So the dispatch man, to make the grid stable, remember, if the demand is less than the supply, the frequency goes very high. If the supply is less than the demand, the frequency goes very low. In each case, the grid is disturbed. If you don't take time, it collapses. So the man who does the dispatch is like actually looking after a woman in labor. So each time he's in that trouble. So during the off-peak period, there's less demand. So if the dispatchman allows the GENCO not to shut down or not to come down from the amount it's generating, the frequency will go haywire. So that's why you see that issue of shutdown or no shutdown. It's simply because the demand has come so low that this power you are generating will rather collapse the system.
Well, Prof, I'm
That's
going to
the
be honest
reason
with
for the
you.
shutdown.
I'm going to be honest with you, Prof. Some of the points you made have been quite hard to understand, even for me, because I mean I'm not a player in that sector. But let me come to our Lagos studio and get Engineer Osiago's thoughts on this one. I don't want this to be like a back and forth, who's at fault. But let's pinpoint the problem. We'll still go over to Comrade and talk about the vandalism aspect of it. But hearing from Prof. About who exactly is dropping the ball here about the supply and demand. At some point, I was lost. I'm going to be honest, but essentially break it down for us further.
You see, Prof is just telling you exactly what the situation is. But bear in mind, we're only talking about 4,000 megawatts that is on the grid, and we're having this turbulence. This is a country as big as Nigeria that should be talking about 40,000, 50,000 megawatts of electricity. So many people in this country don't have power. And we're having issues with the meager 4,000 megawatts in the system. And we're having this turbulence. Prof is talking about the control aspect of it. So if the grid is strong enough, why are we having trouble?
To speak to what Prof said about demand and supply, that we don't have enough demand.
The demand,
what does that mean?
See, the demand is massive in this country.
Okay.
You and I know that so many households in Nigeria today, they are in darkness.
Okay.
Now, what is happening is that the discos, they are cash strapped. They don't have money, to actually expand their infrastructure. That's what. So what are they doing now? They buy power, and they want to give this power to what we call the high ends, those who can pay up to 60 naira and above per kilowatt hour. They call it willing buyer, willing seller. It's an acronym. Now, the masses of this country, who in terms of total quantum, they need this power, are not being served. Okay? Because the
so who is supposed to be demanding the power that Prof says is not being demanded? Is it the discos that are not demanding the power from the Gencos?
I mean, simple economics. When you have high demand, okay, so those who are supplying should work towards, increasing the demand. I mean, the supply, in order, to make more money. But what is happening now? The demand is there, but the capacity to reach out to this,
And that is why the discos are not demanding enough.
Exactly.
Okay, one very quick one from Mr. Ajiru, Comrade Ajiru, before we go. You heard the federal government say recently, two of his major officials talk about vandalism, as being responsible for the recent grid collapse. How did that come across to you? Is this something that we can get ahead of?
Well, I think the transmission network is something that we must guard seriously because it poses a lot of security challenge. Of course, this is not the first time it's happening. It's as old as the industry. We experience it from time to time. But I think that the federal government should increase, its surveillance, on these lines, to avoid, this constant grid collapse as a result of vandalism. There's nothing one can say beyond this, because if it is not, monitored, if there is no security on it, some of them are conditions beyond either TCN or even the players in the industry, because of the network. The network is wide. Somebody was telling you from Lagos to Maiduguri to Umuahia and whatever. So at any point in time, you wouldn't know what is happening in a particular place. So that is why there must be, surveillance if we must succeed, especially with the increased security challenges we're having in the country. I think this is important before we talk of what we are generating, because if what we are generating is being sabotaged, then it's going to be a complex problem for all of us.
You know, Comrade, I also find it rather curious that we've not been able to deliver on that supervisory control and data acquisition SCADA, which the ministry talked about. And this is essentially meant to secure the grid and all of that. But maybe we'll have this conversation in the coming days. But so far, I would like to thank you, Comrade Joe Ajaero, who's the General Secretary, National Union of Electricity Employees and Deputy President of the Nigeria Labour Congress, joining us from our Abuja studio, as well as Professor Frank Okafor, who is a Professor of Electric Power and Control Engineering, University of Lagos, also a former Commissioner, Engineering and Performance Monitoring at NERC. Thank you so much, Prof. And joining us in the studio, Engineer Arthur Osiago, who is a Chartered Electrical Engineer member of Nigeria Society of Engineers and CEO, CCS Technology Limited. Thank you so much, Engineer, for your time.
Thank you for it.